Morning and welcome to today's edition of Start at Zero with me, AV. With me today, I have Sara Roser, who's a director at Avèro, handles a large portfolio of some massive accounts. And today we're talking about rescuing ERP projects that are failing. And we've all been there. Something feels off. The vendors are saying everything's fine. We've paid the invoices. Go live date is approaching pretty quickly. And yet, as a leader, as an executive, you feel like something's off. I don't know how we're going to make this go live date. And that's when we are typically brought in to do an assessment of the health of the project, how it's going, and give a real assessment of where things stand and whether or not this is a success or going to be a success or what the general health of the project is. So, the project we're going to be talking about today was 30 days after the board approved a change order and the SI, the system implementer, which is a global implementer, was already in talks, already talking about extending that go live. So when we came in, it was the extension and the delays were already baked in. And it wasn't about the product. It's never about the product or the software. The software is a world-class product that works for major industries and corporations. And this is what that client was implementing. Um, so what are we going to talk about today? How to see the signs of a failing project. Again, we've talked about project failures ad nauseum on this channel, and others talk about it all the time as sort of attention grabbing headlines. But today we're doing a deep dive into an actual project that was failing, where we had to step in and do a rescue, and what has happened since then. It's still an ongoing engagement, but it's in a better path. It's on a path to success, and we'll dig into why we did that. So, Sarah, you want to give a quick intro of who you are and what you do here?
Absolutely. Thanks, AV. As AV mentioned, I'm a director of client success here at Avèro and have been involved in this health assessment and rescue for this project that we are currently working on, and excited to share some of the insights and updates on where we are at today. It is one of many clients that I support, but it is certainly one that is near and dear to my heart. So excited to chat about it today.
Yeah. So let's talk about rescue versus restart and replace. Right. We when we first went into this account, we got a bunch of documents from everybody, from the client side, from the vendors, saying these are our status reports, our raid logs, our testing scenarios and results. Here's our contracts. What was the first sign when you were reviewing these artifacts or talking to the people there? What were some of the first signs that you sort of looked at it and said, this isn't quite right?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. You mentioned, we were talking to people, conducting interviews from across the SI, the client. We've got stakeholders, we've got functional leads, we've got OCM. We were everywhere talking to everyone. And kind of what immediately jumped out to me was that what we were hearing and what we were seeing in the documentation were not aligned
Hmm.
in many, many cases, right? So we are hearing from people that there's this new go live date, but the documentation and the data is like, whoa, that's not realistic. How are we going to get there with this amount of time? And I think really for me, the biggest kind of aha was, I think every single person we talked to said they had no faith in that go live date. We said, how do
Hmm.
you feel about, this new go live? And every single person said, no, that's not happening. And so that was like, okay, everybody's working towards this date that everyone also is saying is not achievable, and there's no way that we're going to get there. So it was like, time out. That pause needed to happen to say what is actually realistic. If everyone knows
Hmm.
this isn't it, how come no one's saying we need a timeout? We need to come together on this. And I think,
Yeah, and
oh,
sorry, go
sorry.
ahead.
I was going to say, you mentioned the rescue, restart, replace. You know, you've got to dig in to figure out, is the solution viable, right? But there's
Hmm.
missing, some execution or accountability to actually be able to get that project to its go live. Versus, do you restart? Is too much of the plan or what has been configured or delivered so far just so far off from where it needs to be that you've got to do a total restart? Or are you going to replace it, and that delivery model just is not a viable path forward? So those were kind of the three things in the back of our mind as we were conducting those interviews, reviewing the documentation to see where are things really at. Um, and that's especially challenging sometimes when you have conflicting information across different documents, what you're hearing from people. Everybody's got a different perspective.
Yeah, and this is what I wrote the book about, right? It was kind of coincidentally timed when we took this project on, because we were able to really showcase what we're talking about in the book. Is one, not a lot of pre-planning and thinking had gone into this project, and this is all information that the client now has, that they chose a product to replace SAP. They chose Oracle Fusion, which is again a great product, and the user community wasn't quite sure why that happened. At least that's the story that was being told.
Sure.
Why we picked Oracle. We were happy with SAP. What processes we're gonna change? How is this gonna integrate with our other custom and specialized products? None of that thinking was in place, or at least even if documented, it wasn't being used by the people running the project at the time. So when you start a project like that, when you're not quite sure why we're doing this, how are we going to accomplish the things that have been super customized in our organization, that interface with the city of the parent city that owns this organization, and how are we going to interface with all of them? The other problem when I started digging into it was the structure of the internal organization, right? They have finance running the project. And by the way, it's a finance and purchasing project, not HCM, not payroll, none of that. Finance and purchasing. And they had one project manager over this $30 million project that had been a great asset on the SAP side. This person was an SAP expert. They had been managing the SAP instance. They knew everything about this organization. But those skill sets don't quite translate, right? You need PMO, you need project management, program management at a very high level. That is a very different skill set than being able to run a specific product. And I think that played a lot into the dysfunction that happened along the way. So again, if you're in watching us live from somewhere, please let us know where you're from. The chat box is open. Jason is always supportive. Thanks for joining us, Jason from Dallas. And yeah, so back to the case study. And then what happens is when you don't have a clear outline of where you're trying to go or how this is going to happen, change orders start showing up, right? Because you picked a deadline. The other thing that happened was they picked an 18-month implementation. Again, not backed by any math. Yes, it can be done. The vendors will tell you we can do it in 6 months. But how is it going to work for you? What is your definition of go live or that it works? None of that was discussed. So there's a contract now that says 18 months for X amount of dollars. Here's our milestones, which, by the way, were checkbox milestones to me, right? Things like we'll deliver a status report, and that's a milestone, even if the status report is all red and nothing works, and your people are crying in the corner during testing sessions. So all of that to unravel was quite a bit. I think we spent a month just trying to understand the lay of the land. What were some of your other thoughts when you first walked in?
There was definitely a need for some increased governance. in
Hmm.
PMO support for sure. As you said, this is a massive project with one person. Even the best PM in the world couldn't handle all of this, right? There was just way too
Hmm.
much going on for one person to be able to handle. And I think the organization was relying a lot on the SI to be kind of running the PMO. But while that is a great asset to have and they need to be organized, and the SI needs to be able to manage the project from their standpoint, the client needs someone in their corner. They need someone who is driving things for their benefit and from their perspective, and really just representing that client and their best interests. So there was a lot of confusion around who owned things, whether it was a decision or an open item on the raid log. Who was the ultimate person to say yes or no or to flag something as a
Hmm.
risk? The raid log was really used to capture items, but it wasn't really being driven. There was, oh gosh, I'm trying to remember, 100 and something outstanding items. I think it was close to north of 200 open items on the raid log when we first started the engagement. So that was definitely a concern. The other item, as you mentioned, change. There were a lot of
Hmm.
decisions being reopened and changes being made that had previously been signed off on, and there was no governance in place to manage that. So, if in
Hmm.
a testing session or on a call, someone on the client side said, we're not sure we like it this way, we actually want to change it to be this way instead, all of those changes were happening. There was no change control board. There was no change request process in place to validate the impact of doing these changes. What was it going to do to the timeline? What was it
Hmm.
going to cost the client financially? And who was really validating that these were the right changes to be made, right? They had been previously
Yeah.
approved one way, and then someone says we don't like it that way. Well, who's validating that that person has the authority to make that change, right? And that it's a change that's aligned with the bigger picture of what that organization is trying to achieve, right? And I think that kind of ties back into what you were saying about the lack of kind of vision of what the intent was with this project, right? You always want to make sure that every decision that's being made along the way ties back to what that vision is, right? And if it's to transform your business processes to create efficiency, improve reporting, to improve the quality of the output, whatever those goals may be, you got to ask yourself when every change comes up, does this help us achieve that goal, right? And
Yeah.
if it doesn't, then there should be some serious questioning about whether we should be moving forward with that change.
Yeah, and there was a lot of leadership change too, right? In
There was.
three, two CFOs, one CIO, a bunch of other mid-management folks that had left and had turned over. That also that discontinuity of leadership and stewardship also plays a hand into this because when the new CFO comes in, they're asking the same question: Why are we doing this? Who approved this contract? Why is this change order on my desk? What does this buy us? How am I guaranteed that this is going to go live? And who's ultimately in charge? And you bring up a good point on change management. We always think of change management as the pro sci, fluffy, how are people feeling? That's a very important aspect of change management. But just managing change, um, how do you accept mid project a design change that throws your timeline upside down, that adds cost to
Mhm.
the project, that adds time, that adds resources? And if there's no gating of that, and we'll talk about this when we talk about how we set up the change control board, but none of that was present. So you're 8 months into the project, and the decisions that were made at the beginning or in the RFP or in the requirements sessions are now being thrown out. So the vendor, the software vendor and the SI are in a tough position there because they want to deliver what the client wants.
Of
But at the
course.
same time, in the absence of systematic change control management, it can become a free for all, which it did. And there was so many changes that were approved and then unapproved that just held the timeline up. You can't make decisions, and your critical path keeps changing because you don't know which direction you're going to go in. So Jason is has a comment: 30 million project, 1 PM, weak governance and PMO structure, change orders, rate issues. Say no more. These programs are tough enough with all of the supporting structures in place. Well said, Jason. Yeah, and that is the tip of the spear here. And again, everything we talk about in the Start at Zero book, if you haven't received a copy or got one yet, please go to startatzero.averoadvisors.com or just reach out to me on LinkedIn, and we'll make sure you get one. So, Sarah, project's a mess. You're brought in to be the hero. What do we do first? We did a health assessment. What did we assess for, and how did we, other than people's stories and um, all of the sentiment that was floating through the project, what were some of the things that we definitively data back could say that this project is not on a good track? It's not healthy at this point.
Yeah, we again, in addition to the interviews, we combed through the documentation, right? On the client
Hmm.
side, from the SI, we're looking at the RAID log, we're looking at the status reports. 8 of 12 work streams were coded red. There was none in the green.
Hmm.
There were multiple critical issues that had been open, some of them for weeks or months, with no resolution or ETA for resolution. All of the UAT entrance criteria were red. We had testing cycles continuing to move forward despite these readiness gaps and known issues, right?
Hmm.
The majority of key integrations were not complete or on schedule, were significantly off schedule. I already mentioned I think it was close to 200 open RAID log items. So what it came down to is the project continued to move forward based on the calendar, saying it was time to move forward, but not because the data or the work was actually ready to move forward. So we saw that testing cycles just continued because it was the date that the next one was supposed to start, despite the prior testing cycle failing and not
Hmm.
yielding good results. So I think it was really important. I mentioned earlier, like the timeout, right? It's my kids play sports. I think about that that motion there. People knew there was a problem, right? It wasn't a lack of awareness to it. They just didn't convert that awareness into an action plan to do something about it. I don't know if everybody thought, well, I don't know what to do, or it's not my job. But everybody was just moving forward. So it really, that kind of timeout was to take what the documentation and the status really showed us: what is ready, what is not ready, and what needs to happen to get it on a better path, and what might that timeline be.
So you said timeout. So during the health check, the project was still going on,
It sure
right?
was.
To your point, there was some dates that had been set out, and to the SI's credit, they're following their plan. And a lot of this was on the client too, because they were not organized. They were not ready for this.
Yes.
So while they had day jobs, very important, very time consuming ones, they were also required to do the project work. And this is classic. This is not something unique to this client. The clients that do phase zero correctly get ready for this kind of implementation, have backfill strategies. They have strategies to avoid burnout. And a lot of that happened in this project. So we did the health check, we did an analysis and assessment, gave recommendations, and really the client had three or four bad options, right? Walk us through what those options were. Again, to remind the audience, 18-month project, about 14 months in, I don't know, 80% of the budget's burned. Uh, Third sit has failed. There's been no real change management. There's no lock-in of the design, so changes keep coming up.
Mm,
And the estimate was to be live in 3 months from then. And so the health check showed that none of that was true. Yeah, the budget had been burned,
yeah.
and you're not going live in 3 months or 6 months, which was the next date that was thrown out. Again, arbitrarily. How do you know that October one's going to be better than July 1 or Jan 1 if these issues are not resolved? And the issues, to remind everybody, were boundary systems were not they were not integrated. The testing was failing. There had been no UAT or training. The documentation was conflicting in most cases. And so when we did the health assessment and provided those results and the recommendations, there really were four paths in front of the client.
Yeah. So those four paths were do nothing. That's always a choice, right? Just
Hmm.
continue on the path you're on and know that there's probably going to be ongoing change orders. Go live dates are going to continue to get pushed. Uh, and who knows, it could go out another 3 years from that date, right? At the rate
Hmm.
they were going. So significantly increased cost associated with that and timeline. You've also got burnout. People are frustrated. Nobody wants to be working on an ERP implementation for 5 years. So that was option one. A second option was to bring on Avèro as
Hmm.
PMO support, right? It was clear we talked about one PM trying to manage this entire thing. So we, of course, proposed what we thought it would really take from a staffing standpoint for a PMO to be successful and estimated the length of time that it would take to go live, which was, of course, less than do nothing. Third option, scrap the whole thing, right? Cut your losses and move on. You just say, forget it, this isn't working. We're just going to eat this sunk cost and maybe we try again in a year, or maybe we look at a different software solution or vendor. Nobody really likes that option, but it is, of course, an option to walk away and regroup at a later date. And the last option was to move forward with potentially a new system implementer, right? When we first started the health assessment and started talking to both the SI and with the client folks, it was clear everybody wanted to say it was the other person's fault,
Hmm.
right? And the truth is there really was shared accountability there. The On the client side, there was definitely, resource issues. You had folks who were supposed to be fully committed to the project, but also had very important day jobs and were responsible for really critical functions on this project. Plus, their day to day job was very critical. Decisions weren't being made timely. Of course, the kind of internal governance of the PMO, which we've already mentioned. And on the SI side, we talked about some of that phase gate discipline and enforcement, some transparency about really the readiness and quality of what was being delivered during these different test cycles, right? So it wasn't, it wouldn't have been fair to say it was all the SI's fault or it was all
Hmm.
the client's fault, right? It wasn't. They both had some legitimate issues, right, that contributed to the place there we were at. But that was an option, right? If they felt that things weren't working well with the SI, they could decide to move forward, keep the software that they had selected, and bring in a new implementer, which, again, all of these have pros and cons and
Yeah.
risks to them, right? What would that do to your timeline? What does that do to the budget? What does that knowledge transfer look like? Because the fact of the matter is, there wasn't it wasn't to the point where it needed to be scrapped. There was real meaningful work that had been completed,
Hmm.
right? We just didn't have all the pieces to the puzzle that needed to be there. But significant work had been done, and the team did have good knowledge and understanding of where the client was and what it was that they needed. So obviously, everyone can probably assume and interpret they went with option two because we're here talking about it.
Yeah, and that had to be tough working with an incumbent SI that has put a lot of work into this, and then here comes Sarah with her new
Mhm.
ideas and her health assessment. What what were some of the steps you took or your team took to get the SI, the current SI, to have trust in you that you weren't there to kick them out or restart the project or do something else? Because that's a lot of times that there's a blurry line that when we show up to do a health assessment, it's assumed that we're there to poke holes and shoot arrows at whoever's been doing the work there. And some clients expect that. Maybe this one did a little bit too.
Yeah,
But I think the professional that you are and the team that you've put together for that project, we were very clear that we're not here to disrupt anything. We've been brought in to do the health check. And the second part of my question then is, obviously it can be seen as self-serving. Here you are recommending your own services. How did you get over those hurdles?
absolutely. There was definitely an adjustment period, right? When we first came in, we needed to make sure that we were bringing clarity to what our role was and what it wasn't. We're never there to take over and become the SI, right? That's not what we do. And we wanted to make sure that we didn't diminish the value and we're respectful of the role that the SI still played in this. This wasn't about replacing anybody. This was about adding additional support, right? Everyone involved wants to see this be successful, right? So the
Hmm.
more clarity, the more support, the more expertise we can bring, the healthier it's going to be for everyone to move forward, right? So, I mentioned earlier the SI, maybe, having the feeling that, the client's not making decisions timely, the client doesn't have the right resources, and this is why we're not moving forward. It was like, well, we're here, we're more resources, and we're going to help make sure that those decisions happen timely and that they get the support that they need and that they're properly staffed and resourced to move this forward. So we're actually there not only to ensure that the client is successful, but it helps the SI too, right? You don't have to go
Hmm.
chasing these decisions. We're going to chase them now. You don't have to continue saying, they don't have the staffing, they don't have the resources. We're going to come up with a plan and we're going to execute on that to make it happen. So we are here to help support and solve for those issues, not to step on anybody's toes, not to replace anybody. We're just an add on. And I think we are really fortunate. The folks that we are working with, we're all really transparent. We all speak very directly and have worked hard to build that trust with each other. I might get a text message or a phone call on a Saturday from someone at the SI. We're making sure we're always in sync and supporting the overall goal for the client because that's what we're all being paid to do. That
All
was the
right.
first
So
part.
no, that was
Yeah.
wasn't the third part. Um, yeah, and I was there for a lot of this. I saw this in action firsthand because it's not easy. It never is. And if we were in their size spot, we would be as uncomfortable with the whole situation too. So let's move on to the rescue part of this. Right? We've assessed this thing to death. Um, Once you got a handle what needs to happen, and the client picked a position, what did we do? What did your team do? Or what did you do to set this team up and have the right resources? Because again, throwing bodies at a problem like this isn't the solution. which by the way had been tried, right? Through
Mhm.
staff augmentation, projects running slow, let's get 15 staff aug positions that do something related to Oracle or SAP. And
Yeah,
that sort of made things worse than they were. So, what
yeah.
was your approach to filling that governance goal hole and the project management hole, the communication hole? How did you? How was the rescue plan set up?
Yeah, so it was almost like taking a step back and pretending this wasn't like a mid-implementation project. How would I recommend to staff this from the start? And I will also say, yes, it may seem self-serving that we were recommending Avero as the
Hmm.
PMO. It didn't have to be us. It could have been anyone, right? But the
Yeah.
recommendation was you need a full PMO and you need folks who have expertise in this area. So we ended up coming up with a plan to have a program manager full time on site with a client to be that single point person to oversee everything and make sure that things were synced and aligned and we were achieving those goals and deadlines that we needed to. Project managers to help in the finance and procurement side, and then, of course, we needed consultants to support that and a dedicated OCM lead. So, identifying the roles and the number of people was the easy part. Finding the right people to fill those positions, gosh, the stars really aligned because we ended up with the most incredible team. And I don't just say that because they're my team. They were just, we really needed people who had that strong project management experience. You had a lot going on with data migration and boundary systems and integrations. So we needed folks that had really strong technical expertise to be able to lead and understand those. And you needed the right personality and the right
Hmm.
fit to make sure they were going to align with the client's culture and also be a great partner with the SI, right? So
Yeah.
it felt like we were searching for unicorns for a little bit there, but somehow they all appeared, and we were very lucky to have a really strong team in place. Once that team rolled out, it was a matter of identifying what are the most critical items that have to be solved for before we can move forward, right? And some of that was what we talked about, change control, right? That was quickly just snowballing and spiraling out of control. So that was one of the first items that we worked on, evaluating what meetings are happening, who's in those meetings, are they productive, are they the right cadence, do we have the right people there, um, and then getting them to not just take what we had already provided in the health assessment but do their own little kind of mini assessments, right? If I'm the project manager over finance, I need to talk to those functional leads, I need to talk to the product owners, I need to hear from them what's going well, what's not going well, and I need to validate that against what the documentation is showing me. Uh, so there was a ramp up time, right? We
Hmm.
needed to get these folks up to speed on what was happening and not only introduce these new governance tools, but also continue to drive the project and all of those decisions and items that need to be having. Because, as you said, there was no pause. I say timeout, but it was like a mental timeout, right? There was
Hmm.
no pause where work stopped. It was still continuing on. So it was busy. I would say that first 30 days was really busy, but the team really banded together to get it done.
You mentioned program manager and project managers.
Hmm.
Why program manager? Because that's a different level of management, right? Program is a collection of related projects. It was previously being run as one project, and you would think it's finance and procurement. It's not like a full suite ERP where you have asset management, HCM, payroll, in which case a program manager is very justified. Why
Hmm.
did this one need a program manager?
Good question. The size of the project, as we talked about, this is a $30 million project for a large organization, and you have finance and procurement work streams. There's a need for OCM, and then you have this technical side, right? Which is, of
Mhm.
course, closely linked and intertwined with finance and procurement, but you've got 40 different data extracts. You've got, gosh, I think, 12 to 15 boundary systems in place. And every one of these areas needed a lot of attention and a lot of focus. And the reason we brought on a program manager was to help oversee all of that, to ensure that everything was in lockstep, right? We can't just have the finance PM focused solely on finance and the technical side strictly focused on the technical piece. Everybody needs to be communicating, and there needs to be that overlying vision to make sure that we're all moving in the same direction with that same goal. And the program manager is really helping to do that and ensure everyone is aligned and we're all moving cohesively in the same direction.
And executive communication, right? You need,
Absolutely.
when you're talking with top level, top notch CFOs, CIOs, CEOs of organizations, you need someone that will speak that language, will have the same understanding of risk that those folks do. I think that was a huge part
Yeah.
of what the program manager, again, the right program manager can do is have that real open line with the executives and they can speak the same language in addition to doing all the things you mentioned.
Absolutely. And it's important when you're talking about executive sponsors, like you mentioned, CFO, CIO, these are very, very busy folks. And
Hmm.
this project is one piece of many, many things that they have on their plate at any time. So having one source of information who can properly deliver at the level that that person needs is key. If we had four project managers without that person? Are they having four weekly meetings? Are they getting four separate updates? That's not what any executive wants.
Yeah.
So yeah, our program manager works to consolidate all of that information and use it to feed to the executive team.
Yeah. And if you download or go to Start Zero and get the book, there's all kinds of other resources available that will help you set your teams up for success because we have checklists, case studies, toolkits, templates, all of that in the book and on the supporting website. Uh, there's a question coming in. Jason's asking, did the new CFOs, CIOs engage and get behind the program? I think you take that one.
Yes, yes, absolutely. You can't have a project of this magnitude and not have IT support and involvement, right? It really is a critical component. So I am happy to say the new CIO is on board, very supportive, and has provided resources whenever asked from their team to help ensure this is successful and that we're getting what we need.
Yeah, and it's a tough position too, right? The people that made this decision are no longer there. And maybe the new set of executives may not have made that decision. So for them to own it and see it through the finish line is again a huge risk for them. So in some ways they have to be supportive, but again, they always have the option of pulling the plug on something that's not going well, which they've chosen not to do. And when it comes to large scale implementations like this, we see different flavors of this. And typically the IT or the CIO's office runs these projects. It's the executive sponsor. In this case, it's the CFO, primarily because it's a financial system and it's purchasing. What are your thoughts on who should own a project like this at the executive level?
I don't think it's a one size fits all. I think it really depends on the organization and ultimately, as we've mentioned several times, what that greater vision is
Hmm.
or the goal is. If it's primarily, a finance transformation, I can see it makes sense to have that live with the CFO. If there's if it's a huge, maybe a really old system and it's not so much a finance transformation, but more of an IT upgrade happening, I think the most important thing is not the title of who your executive sponsor is. How engaged are they and how supportive are they? Because from a change management standpoint, you need visibility, and that executive leader needs to be able to communicate with the group. They need to be supportive. They need to be able to explain. And of course, that's something that we can help support them on, but they've got to really be in it and be able to be focused and dedicated for 18 to 24 months most times. So,
Hmm.
who it is or what their title is to me doesn't matter as much as their ability to make decisions, drive things forward and be engaged. And it should never rest solely on one person's shoulders. You may have one person named as the
Hmm.
executive sponsor, but I think any strong leader will consult with multiple people if needed, right? If something comes up that's out of their wheelhouse or they want to bounce something, the CIO can do that with the CFO or vice versa. It's having a team of people to support the effort.
Yeah, and it also comes down to the business outcomes, right? The CFO owns the financial system and the processes that the system will help run, the transparency it's going to create. And a lot of times, CIOs don't have that in depth knowledge of what needs to happen. So you're right, the collaboration is key, but also it's super important to have one chief. Who's running this project? Who gets to make the final decisions when things get hairy or there are conflicting ideas? I think the business users, when it comes to workflows and outcomes, typically need to be that person. Infrastructure, security, what happens after the consultants leave, who maintains the product, all of that typically falls on in the CIO's column there. Okay, so rescue team established. Did we do any kind of realignment with the SI, rescoping, replanning of the project? Because, right, the health check showed that 3 months from now, we're not going to go live, nor are we going to go live in 6 months. And I'm sure there was some, you know, dropping of the shoulders from the end users and people that have been involved in this project, but also some resistance from the people that had uh, written the check or signed the contract saying, we're not going back to the board and saying we're delayed again. We just did that. What was that like, and how did you navigate those waters?
Yeah, we definitely sat down with the SI and had to replan. We had to talk through where things realistically were at today, where they need to get before a go live, and what needs to happen in between to get there, right? And how much time is
Hmm.
that going to take? Are we ready to do we have the right people and governance in place to do that? If not, how long is it going to take to get there? How many more test cycles do we need? Does the finance team have a blackout period during budget that we need to account for? So yeah, we sat in a room for a couple of days, virtual whiteboard style, and mapping out. And the solution didn't come easy. There were multiple iterations and things that we really wanted to make work, but weren't going to be feasible, right? Nobody wants to push the go live date out further than it needs to be, but we also had to be very realistic with where things were at. And you could say, okay, well, we're going to allow, 3 weeks for this test cycle. Okay. How long has it taken historically? They've been taking like 6 weeks.
Hmm.
Okay. Well, let's plan for 6. If that's the reality of what we have seen, we can't make a replan and assume that suddenly we're going to cut that time in half, right? And then we're going to end
Yeah.
up being in the same position. So it was really coming in to ask questions and get aligned with the SI. And we did walk out with a new timeline and a replan that everyone felt comfortable with. This is achievable. We can do this. It's not going to be easy. There's going to be some tight timelines, but we all felt that it was achievable if we were working together based on what we knew had happened historically and what we knew had to happen to get us there.
And from the user community, I mean, because picking that go live date is an art and a science, right? In some ways it's very mathematical,
Hmm.
dependencies and project durations, all of that. But at the same time, you don't know what you don't know. So how do you plan for those contingencies? Because now with the replan and the project moving forward, you have new dates and new expectations set.
Hmm.
And a lot of what happened previously was, someone else's fault. And now it's on the new PMO because this is the rescue plan, this is the solution. What's the mechanism for catching those risks that may be out of your control?
I think transparency and communication as soon as a risk is identified, right? There's stuff that comes up every day, every week, right? And I think the PMO's job is to work through and mitigate those as much as we can, without involving, the executive team or pulling them in to make a decision if it's something that we can work through. But ultimately, if something is going to be in danger of not happening, the timeline is in question or budget is in question, those things need to be raised early. You cannot be afraid to deliver bad news or identify a risk. The sooner you can do that, if it's validated it as a real risk,
Hmm.
great. I could give you an example. The most recent test cycle, there were 40 total data extracts, and I think like 36 of them were done on time, and there were 4 that weren't. But before we report and say, these aren't done on time, this test cycle is at risk, we validated with the team that they were going to be done within the next 24 hours. Okay, so we can check with the SI and say, will that work? Does that impact the timeline? No, within 24 hours, we can work with that. Okay, great. You don't need to raise an alarm. You don't need to raise a red flag. But if the SI had said, hey, yeah, that 24 hours is going to push this whole timeline, and now this is at risk or this is at risk, then those are things that you need to run up the chain. So it's taking the time to validate what's really happening and not being afraid to raise that risk or concern, but knowing when to do it and when it can be mitigated on your own.
Yeah, and this isn't new stuff, right? This is Yeah, of course, we talk about this again in the book, Start at Zero. And you mentioned something when you started replanning and putting the team together. You really thought about how would you do it if this was a day one project.
Mhm.
So the principles apply. It's just what wasn't done a year and a half ago had to be done later.
Mhm.
You have to do these hard things, the whiteboarding, the dependence checking. And none of that was done. So it didn't show up in the contract. And so the milestone management and the contracting was simply a bunch of check boxes.
Yep.
So what sort of contracting leverage should anyone that is in the process of now thinking about ERP, selecting a vendor, what are a few lessons that you can leave them with on that end? Because at the end of the day, the black and white on the piece of paper is going to win.
Mhm.
Feelings are
Absolutely.
not going to come into play. And then it becomes this fight over what we meant was not in the contract, but that's what it says. That's what the board approved.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a couple of lessons learned. would be you want to make sure if you've got milestone or deliverables that are tied to payments, that those are tied to things that will meaningfully move your project forward. For example, you could say completion of sit one. Okay, but does completing sit one get you any closer to a successful go live if you had an 80% failure rate? No.
Hmm.
You've got to have criteria. What does success look like for entering or exiting any of these gates or milestones? I've seen, not on this particular engagement, but on some other engagements where there is kind of a ranking of, okay, this is the payment if you hit these goals. And if it's less than that, if it falls between this range, this is going to be the lower payment. And if it falls below this, maybe it's zero payment. Um, so there's definitely opportunity within those milestones and deliverables to make sure that you are getting the results that you need to drive the project forward. Because as we said, just checking the box to say that something was done, it looks like, oh, okay, you completed sit one. Great. Yep, that
Hmm.
deserves a payment. But if it fails, well, what's next? Where do you fall back on after that? That doesn't help drive the project forward. Um, the other thing I would say is ensuring there's an appropriate review process for
Hmm.
what those deliverables are and making sure that is adhered to, review times and things like that. I've seen as little as 3 days in a contract before. I've seen 2 weeks before to review a deliverable or milestone. So making sure that there's adequate time based on who the folks are going to be assigned to reviewing those and knowing what their workload is, to be able to do that and making sure it's something that works for you, because the last thing that you want is for something to get default auto approved,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Well, you didn't meet the timeline, so we got to keep going forward, and now you just approved, potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in payment or accepted a deliverable that no one even had eyes on.
Well, and I'll add one. Who's allowed to sign off on these milestones and deliverables?
Mhm.
Because there always are terms and conditions in the contract that say, okay, if you didn't review a deliverable or tell us that it's not to your satisfaction within a certain day, we'll rework, and there's a timeline associated with that. But a lot of times, and in this case, it was one person was approving everything, no matter what the size of the
Yeah.
milestone was, and it was almost a rubber stamp. There was a lot of leeway given to, okay, 80%'s done. You know what? Fine, we'll sign it. 20% is going to get done in the next week or so.
Mhm.
But in that case, project management in that case is very specific. It's math. It's done or not done, right? Not at 80/20. Maybe at 99.9% you can have some give. Uh, Jason, keep the questions coming. Loving it. Was there a comprehensive SOW in place between the client and SI that supported the program? Yes, there was. Right?
There was. There was it, as we mentioned, there was leadership changes, right? So you've
Mhm.
got executives coming in and inheriting something that they didn't have part of, inputting or validating or signing off on. So it was there. Um, SOW was very long, comprehensive. There's a lot in there, but the actual day to day practice wasn't always aligned with what was in the SOW.
Right. And that's where the governance and the management structure comes in, because the SOW said something. And if you're not keeping the change gates that are mentioned in the SOW, that there will be a change control board and all of these things, but none of that happened. So the SOW changed constantly. 14 months in, the SOW looked very different than what was signed. because there was no checking and denying of changes that were not necessary. So yeah, Jason, there was an SOW, but it changed quite a bit. And that's not good because the change control needs to start with the SOW. And you have to have really good reason for why a change is being requested. And how does that impact the SOW, the contract, the payments, go live date? All of the above was not being done effectively. Okay. Any other thoughts, Sarah? Big overarching learnings, lessons learned that you would take forward into other projects or recommend other people pay attention to?
Oh dear, so many things. Like, we've talked about a lot of them. I think, oh gosh,
If there's
I
none, that's fine.
yeah, I'm just trying to think because there's so many things. I think the the biggest takeaway here isn't that like progress on a project means everything is green,
Hmm.
right? It's when something isn't ready, you have a program in place that will adapt and change its behavior, right? Like, you can see that things are yellow or things are red, but what are you doing about it? What is the change? If that that particular work stream or area is red month after month, week after week, what is being done about it, right? The reporting is just one small piece. It's really the behavior and the people that drive the project and drive that change. So it's
Oh,
learning to ask those questions and not just trust what is being reported and accepting it.
yeah. And Jason making a great point here. Getting the SOW right from phase zero. Phase zero was not done. We kind of did
Mhm.
it 18 months, 16 months in, can have a huge impact on the success of the program or the failure of the program. Uh, Very well said. Um, I think that's such a huge point. Again, starting at zero is simply talking about this project is not about technology. All the products do very similar things. They may have their own secret sauce and different things they hang their hats on, but at the end of the day, you're trying to move work through your organization and get stuff done. These projects typically fail or end up in a bad spot because you don't have the governance, the change management, both kinds, program management, and the discipline this requires over 18 to 24 months to do it right. Because things change, expectations change, technology changes pretty quickly, right? And we haven't even talked about, we haven't mentioned AI in this talk today, which is mind blowing. None of that is being discussed in the scope of the project. You're in 2026 working on a project that was conceived probably in 2024, and tech has moved on. A lot of these things that our clients struggle with, especially in the government, right, because they're deploying ideas from 2 years ago, is they can't move fast enough to really take advantage of what tech is really offering today, which is a shame because you're still stuck in how are we going to get data out of this system and move it into that. A lot of that can happen when you do phase zero planning. If you're doing it today, make sure you're taking into account how implementations can happen today. And we've used tools like Irma and Caliber during this project that have helped us speed things up, become more accurate, more data backed, and that is the future. And I'm not revealing too much here. I'm going to do a live stream on Caliber in the next couple of weeks. It's our product that we've built that does a couple of things. One is helps our clients identify which products fit their needs the best because we have used all of our institutional knowledge and baked it into Caliber. So if we're talking today with the CFO, we can have a meaningful conversation on if these are your workflows, this is your vision, this is your these are your needs. Here's the latest data sets from all the vendors on the market, and it'll tell you which one fits you best. It's not a decision making tool. but it will get you thinking about what's possible, what
Mm.
might be the best avenues for us. You still run the RFP process. And then on the PMO side, we've used Caliber for tracking data from source to the report so that the report doesn't show green while everything else is red, right? So we're taking this a step further from being story based to really data based. And I can't wait to showcase that product to the world. But Sarah, thank you so much today for joining and sharing the story of the rescue. Um, I know it's not over, but I hope this plan succeeds. I don't think there's much choice there, but
Yep.
lots of great lessons learned here. And I think the underscoring lesson is that start at zero. Phase zero is critical because you will have to come back and do it at some point when you figure out that where you are isn't really where you intended to be.
Absolutely. Thanks, Evie.
Thank you. And thanks everyone who joined. If you have other questions, if you need to get a hold of me or Sarah, reach out to us on LinkedIn, and hopefully we'll get to chat with you in person here soon. So if you want to look at some of our other videos, consume some of our other blog posts, we're on YouTube, LinkedIn, Substack, everywhere. But we live on LinkedIn, so just reach out, and we'll see you on another live stream. Thank you.